So we have much to discuss. Here's our panel. In the studio, Juan Carlos Hidalgo is a policy analyst at the Center for Global Liberty and Prosperity, part of the Cato Institute. Also with us here in Washington, D.C. is Lisa Haugard. She's the executive director of the Latin America Working Group. From Chicago, Eunice Escobar is the chairwoman of Witness for Peace. And Peter Hakim, sitting with us also in the studio, is the president emeritus of the Inter-American Dialogue. Welcome to you all. I think our viewers deserve a little bit of a history lesson, just to remind everybody of what the Farc has been doing over the last 50 years in Colombia. Juan Carlos Hidalgo, they were a very brutal organization, weren't they?
Indeed, they were born in the early 1960s as a peasant movement demanding more equal distribution of land. Marxist inspiration, inspired by the Cuban Revolution. They became extremely powerful in the 1990s when they took over the business of drug trafficking from the Medellin cartel and the Cali cartel that were dismantled. Back then, they, at some point early in the 2000s, they were about to take over the biggest cities in Colombia. They surrounded Medellin, they surrounded Bogota. And they engage in terrible crimes, not against the armed forces of Colombia, but against civilians. We're talking about kidnappings, extortions, torture of prisoners. Some prisoners were held for over a decade. Forceful abortions of female soldiers, recruiting of children as soldiers, and so on. And that's why, for many Colombians, it's such a bitter pill to pardon the members of the Farc and letting them to enjoy, civil rights as this peace accord has granted them.
Well, Lisa, I particularly remember the case of Ingrid Betancourt, who was a presidential candidate. She was running for the presidency, and she was campaigning in the rural areas, and the Farc got her and held her for 6 years, from 2002 until 2008. I mean, how is it possible that they could hide somebody of that stature for so long? Nobody saw her apart from on video for 6 years.
Well, they had substantial control of parts of the countryside, and she was indeed captured with her campaign manager, Clara Rojas, who went on to be a member of the Colombian Congress. It was very brutal, but the Farc were not the only brutal actors. So were the paramilitaries, kind of a right-wing guerrilla group, and as well as the armed forces themselves.
Yes, the whole thing was a spiral of despair, wasn't it, in many ways? And Peter, why did it last so long? I mean, a lot of times these kind of conflicts last for 10 or 20 years, maybe even a little bit longer. But this went on for more than 50 years. Why so long?
A good question, because, in fact, we have so few cases in which it has gone on so long, with neither side really having much of a chance of winning an outright victory. How did it go on so long? It's not an easy answer. I mean, in part, it's Colombian geography. In part, it's the sort of distinctions among different population groups in Colombia that, the people living in the cities didn't seem to care much about rural areas, the degree of poverty and inequality in the rural areas. That's sort of the broad general cruelty and brutality is unmatched in many ways, certainly in Latin America. I mean, many people who have worked there with the United Nations or from other Latin American countries have said that, this is the cruelest country in Latin America. And it was one of the most corrupt as well. I mean, and then, of course, they became an ideal place to cultivate cocaine and share a trafficking route. And that created a source of income, as you suggested. And not only was the group sort of ideologically motivated, it had the money to sustain itself. Right. And whether people were motivated by the money or the ideology, together they were a terribly powerful force.
But it went on and on. Eunice Escobar in Chicago, I suspect that Chicago is a place where much of the drugs that were sold and money laundered by the Farc and by other organizations in Colombia ended up. You're there with the people in Chicago. How do the people of Chicago think about this conflict now that it is actually over?
Well, the people that I work with, most of them are very well informed of the situation in Colombia. We take delegations every year to visit the rural areas of Colombia and the Afro-Colombian communities. So most of them are very hopeful with peace happening in Colombia.
Well, let's look at how the party may now be constituted, because that's the thing that we need to make the point about. It was a guerrilla organization for 50 years, but it is now a political party. Lisa, how is it constituted? Is it properly constituted within the laws of Colombia? Is the former leadership still in place and prepared to take it forward now?
Yes, the political party was just launched as was planned once the Farc had laid down all their arms, and all of that was verified by the UN political mission. So the Farc can enter politics. There is a reaction against that in some sectors in Colombia, but this is the common practice. In a peace process, both the guerrilla forces have to get some kind of involvement in political life in order to have a sustainable peace process. So this will go forward. They're not going to be advancing much on a national level, but in certain areas they may get some limited support, but it is a necessary step to move forward.
Juan Carlos, this is not the first time that we've seen former guerrillas step forward and become political leaders. Now, we're at the beginning of this process regarding Colombia, but we've seen it elsewhere, off the top of my head. Northern Ireland, South Africa, even Brazil.
El Salvador, the current government of Salvador is the former guerrilla. It's common practice, indeed, to grant political rights and allow a former insurgency to become a political party. What is not common practice is to guarantee them seats in Congress, and this is what this deal has done. The Farc is going to have 5 seats in the lower house. It's going to have 5 seats in the Senate, and the accord establishes 16 circumscriptions of peace, so-called circumscription of peace, which are basically a way to grant the Farc another 16 seats in the lower house. And this has enraged many Colombians, because not only has they given them immunity for the crimes that they committed, but they also are going to have granted political participation in Congress, and the government is going to heavily subsidize the new political party. It's going to be one of the political parties in Colombia with the most resources due to taxpayers' money.
Yeah, and yet, Peter, this is the price for peace in many ways. However, some people do think this is a really unfair disadvantage. They're not only guaranteed 5 seats in the lower house, but they're guaranteed 5 seats in the upper house, which is much more difficult to attain.
Look, you know, the Colombian population voted on this peace deal, and they voted it down. And this was a great surprise to many people outside of Colombia. How could the Colombians vote against peace? And what is pretty clear is that the Colombians thought the Farc had already been defeated as a guerrilla. And so why reward them with seats, with transitional justice, which meant basically a free pass, etc. On the other hand, that deal has been made. We can discuss whether there should have been harsher penalties on them, or whether they should have gotten 3 seats instead of 5, or no seats. But that's the car we now have, and we have to drive it forward if we're going to have a lasting peace, yeah. I think.
I just wanted to say the president stepped in, didn't he? Because the people rejected it, but the president stepped in, tweaked it, and then it finally passed.
Well, he didn't tweak it. He tweaked it in negotiations. But like I say, the defeat was one of those great surprises, like the Brexit in international politics, and the people who had suffered most often voted most against the agreement, which was also surprising.
Unlike Brexit, the parliament in Britain didn't subvert the will of the people, as it happened in Colombia.
But in any event, the will of the people was a few percentage points. We could argue about that. But in any event, the question now is, we have this vehicle. It seems to be moving along, maybe it's too slowly, maybe it's making mistakes, but I think it's the only peace mobile we have right now, and we ought to stick with it.
Lisa, you are nodding your head, and you raise your eyebrows at the word subvert.
Well, look, there are 260,000 people dead. There are 7 million displaced. There are 50,000 disappeared people. This war has got to end. And this, as Peter says, this is the deal that was struck. Everyone has to compromise in a peace process. People suffered under the Farc. They suffered from the paramilitary forces. They suffered from the actions of the armed forces themselves. The only way out is peace. This is the deal. And I think it is incumbent upon the international community to really get behind this, support it, and make sure that the peace is fully implemented on all sides.
Eunice, I'm going to come to you in just a second, but before I do, you will gather from this discussion that the people of Colombia are quite divided when it comes to whether the Farc should be allowed to be a political party, and certainly whether they should have those 5 guaranteed seats in the 2 houses, 10 in all. Let's have a listen now to what the people on the streets in Colombia are saying about this deal.
I feel great hope to leave behind so much violence, 50 years of violence, a lot of deaths, and a lot of despairing families.
I don't like the fact the FARC are entering politics because of all the violent acts they've committed, all the murders, all of that. They should rather pay for this in jail.
Eunice, tell me about the people in Chicago and what they are saying between the need for justice and retribution and this free pass idea that many people think the Farc have achieved with this deal.
I just wanted to clarify that a lot of the victims of this war, the indigenous and the Afro-Colombian communities, did support the peace agreement. These are the people that had been victimized by the violence, and they were very supportive of the peace agreement. There has been a history in Colombia of violence where indigenous and Afro-Colombians people are being victimized, and they were moving forward supporting the peace agreement. They were very vocal and very involved in this peace process. And so it is very important for us to recognize that the victims of the war have been supporting the peace process. We are very much in support of the peace, and our big interest is now for the victims of the war to be part of the table, to be part of the plan that is coming forward for the implementation of the peace process. This is very important for the Afro-Colombian people, for the indigenous people, and we in Chicago are very aware of that because we visit them very often.
There is a lot of dissatisfaction, isn't there, in Colombia with the political process generally. Juan Carlos, do you think with the addition of the Farc as a political party, interest in politics could be rejuvenated in Colombia? And I come back to Brazil again, and we've seen this before. Brazil's an example.
There is a lot of dissatisfaction with the political class. Actually, there was a recent poll by Gallup that showed that the Farc has more support than all the other parties combined. Because the other political parties have been robbed by corruption scandals. President Santos is extremely unpopular. His popularity hovers around 13 to 20%. So indeed, there is a lot of dissatisfaction in Colombia. We have to emphasize a point. Nobody in Colombia wants war. Consistently throughout the peace process, Colombians supported the peace process, but they also said that they weren't willing to support peace at the expense of justice. And the polls indicate that over 70% of Colombians repeatedly said, we want justice and not peace at any cost. Now, to use another expression very used when it comes to Brexit, you cannot have the cake and eat it. Maybe that's the case. Maybe there is a sacrifice that has to be made and the Colombians don't know themselves. But we have to keep in mind that the peace process is extremely unpopular and it has polarized the Colombian society.
Well, that is very interesting. Can I ask you all, does it matter that the Farc acronym is going to remain? For our viewers, FARC stands for the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, and the new acronym is the Common Alternative Revolutionary Force. Now, in Spanish, that still spells out FARC. So, Lisa, is that good or bad?
Well, if I'd been their PR firm, I wouldn't have supported that choice. They voted on it, and this is what they chose. I think it is, though, I think it's unfortunate, but I think it's much more important to see that the FARC has so far been abiding by the by the accords, the peace accords, and it's important to really monitor that they keep doing that, because it's really about not returning to violence, not returning to crime, and integrating into society. And if they do that, that is what we all should have our eyes on.
And Peter, are they showing signs of really wanting to do that, or is the ceasefire potentially in danger?
We really have to see how this works through. We have an election coming up, a presidential election early next year, I think in April, if I'm not mistaken. And the peace process and the treatment of the FARC and the actions of the FARC and the actions of the military and paramilitary are all going to be very much part of this campaign. Talking to Colombians, they refuse to make any predictions about how this is all going to work its way through the politics, and whether politics will find a way to sort of accept some form of compromise and begin to build some kind of consensual politics, or in fact, I think more people think that it's going to create more chaos and more distrust and tension among different groups in the society. And that's unfortunate that the politics, which are difficult enough in themselves, are mixed up with the peace process and the peace process with them, and they can't be disentangled at this point. And how it all comes out will determine Colombia's future, and very hard to predict at this point.
And there's another element to this, isn't there? The ELN, which is another guerrilla group, and the government has reached an agreement with them. What part might the ELN and the process that has led to so far peace with them, we understand, where might that lead us?
There is a truce that was agreed upon the visit of Pope Francis. It's going to last 100 days. The negotiations were launched earlier this year in Ecuador. They have proven very difficult. This is another left-wing guerrilla, but with a different kind of aspiration and inspiration. So it's been difficult for the Colombian government to crack this one. But one of the things that we have to keep in mind is that when the government promised peace after this accord, it didn't take into account the fact that there's still another guerrilla. Right. And all the other related violence that we have seen lately in Colombia after the peace accord was signed has been, the responsibility has been given to the ELN. So we'll see, because that plays into the hands of the government, saying that the FARC are actually complying with the accord, and all the other violence that we see out there is either dissidents of the FARC or the ELN. So it's very convenient for the government.
Lisa, do you think that in the end, politicians and the need to drive things forward and, of course, to win votes will win out, and they will be able to sort these issues out?
All we can do is hope so and work for peace. The government really needs to step up also in terms of peace accord implementation. It's been very slow.
Do you think, is it capable of stepping up, do you think?
It's capable, but it hasn't so far, and that's really worrisome. The other concern is that in addition to the ELN still being out there as a guerrilla group that needs to be, the peace process needs to move forward, and that's going to be hard. There's also successor groups to the paramilitaries that are causing a lot of violence as well right now, and they really need to be dismantled, and that has not happened sufficiently so far. There have been a lot of killings of social leaders in the countryside, and some of that is due to the paramilitary successor groups.
Eunice, in Chicago, this is a conundrum, isn't it? You represent Witness for Peace, but this is a real conundrum. The government didn't take into account other guerrilla organizations like the ELN until it was too late.
Yes, that is a concern, but we also are very hopeful that they will come along to support a peace process. And as I mentioned before, the victims are very interested in this happening. We just received a letter from the Comisión Étnica from Colombia, that is formed for mostly indigenous and Afro-Colombian groups, asking for participation in the implementation of the plan. And they're still very hopeful that the peace is going to happen in Colombia. So while it's concerning that there's still paramilitary groups very active in Colombia and killing activists and human rights leaders and union leaders, we're still very hopeful that Colombia is going to reach peace.
Now, if the FARC moves forward as a successful political party, bearing in mind that they have these 5 seats in the lower and upper house, is it, in the end of the day, Lisa, going to come down to a rural, where they used to operate, city split in cities like Bogota and Cali and Cartagena?
One of the driving forces of the conflict has been the split between urban, developed Colombia and rural areas that have been neglected. So that is something that all forces, all political forces will have to address, that split and that inequality if there's really to be a lasting peace.
Are we getting access to rural areas now? When I say we, I mean, are they getting access to rural areas now pretty much for the first time? And how might that grow and expand the economy in the future?
Yes, there is more access, without a doubt. Even people who oppose the peace accord recognize that, and now it's the responsibility of the Colombian government to bring services, healthcare, education, schools, etc., to these areas that were neglected, where the state was basically absent for decades. But now we have to mention the elephant in the room: drug trafficking. Coca cultivation soared in the last two years in Colombia. And as long as that business remains illegal, as long as drug trafficking remains illegal, you're going to have illegal groups, whether the FARC or dissidents of the FARC or the ELN, in charge of this trade.
Well, this brings us to the great worry that Washington, D.C. has about what's going on in Colombia, because in place was Plan Colombia, in which they worked with the government in Bogota. And the major worry about all this is whether the drugs trade would continue in some way. I mean, what do you think, Lisa? It seems as if, you know, we know what it's like. It seems as if it may.
The peace accords actually have a policy, a chapter on drug policy, which is very unusual. And if the government were to really try to fully implement that in terms of helping small farmers switch to legal crops, that would help. It will never solve the problem of the drug war or illegal drugs. That's going to continue, but it's very important for the international community to really keep our eyes on the prize, which is the peace process, yes, and not get too distracted.
I mean, Peter, does Washington have a role to play?
Oh, clearly, it's long been involved with Colombia. I think that the financing that the U.S. gave with Plan Colombia, one can disagree with elements of the plan, were critical in mobilizing Colombian funding and greater attention to resolving this immense challenge and tragedy of the country. I think the U.S. really needs to stay with this, particularly financing this development and the number of things that Juan mentioned, getting into the rural areas, providing public services. But one thing has to be remembered, that Latin American countries generally haven't been terribly successful there. Mexico has had peace for how many years, and still it's one of the most violent places in Latin America, maybe the world. And the rural areas of Brazil are sort of, the violence is decreasing in cities but growing in rural areas of Brazil today. And you have Central America more deaths per capita now than there were during the civil wars. So this post-war, the sort of peace era, has not been terribly successful in many countries. And Colombia is going to have a mix that's not going to be totally successful. It's not going to end the violence in Colombia in any short period of time. It's not going to certainly do much to deal with the drug issue. In fact, it's been after the peace process is in place that the drug production has grown. So I just think we have to keep within reasonable limits our expectations of what we're going to see out of Colombia and recognize this is a long-term process.
Well, you've all explained that very eloquently today, but I suppose we have to end it by saying, you know, at least there is a chance, and there is at least peace, like there was peace in Northern Ireland, and that's, I think, where they have to look now to the future to try and, you know, stabilize the country. But as you say, there are big issues. Juan, Peter, Lisa, and Eunice, thank you all very much indeed. Thank you. And that's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm John Terrett in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.